Richard was 72 when he first noticed the changes. It began subtly. A few extra nighttime trips to the bathroom, a slight hesitation before the urine began to flow, and a growing discomfort he couldn't quite explain. Like many men his age, he dismissed it at first. Just getting older, he told himself, shrugging it off with a tired chuckle. But deep down, something didn't feel right. He wasn't alone. Across the world, countless men experience similar signs, quietly accepting them as part of aging. But what if those signals weren't just about age? What if they were warnings of something preventable? As a retired teacher, Richard had always believed in learning. He just hadn't expected to become a student of his own health at this stage of life. It was during a regular afternoon walk with his neighbor George, ADD retired nurse, that the topic came up. George listened carefully, then said, "Richard, have you ever thought that it might not be your age doing this? It could be your daily habits." That sentence stuck with Richard long after the conversation ended. He began researching and learned something surprising. The prostate, a small gland under the bladder, can enlarge over time, not just due to aging, but because of how we live. Richard discovered that simple things, like not drinking enough water, sitting too much, or constantly feeling stressed, could slowly lead to inflammation and prostate enlargement. It wasn't about illness, but about small, repeated stresses the body silently absorbs over the years. What seemed like harmless routines could build up into something far more uncomfortable. As he read more, Richard began to feel both relief and regret. Relief that there were ways to help himself, and regret that he hadn't known sooner. But instead of dwelling on what he didn't know, he chose to act. 72 isn't too late, he thought. I can still make changes. That decision marked the beginning of a new chapter for Richard. Not a radical transformation, but a gentle, thoughtful return to listening to his body and respecting its needs. With each day, he made small adjustments, rooted in understanding and care. This story isn't about miracles. It's about knowledge, action, and hope. In the following parts, we'll walk through 7 practical steps Richard took to restore balance and comfort, starting with one of the most underestimated elements of all, water. Richard began his journey toward better health the very next morning. He stood in his kitchen, staring at the steaming mug of coffee in his hand. A ritual so familiar, it felt like part of his identity. But George's words echoed in his mind. Your daily habits, not your age. He set the mug down, reached for a glass, and filled it with water. It felt strange, almost rebellious, to drink water before coffee. But something told him this was a small but important change. Over the years, Richard had gotten used to limiting his fluid intake. Like many men his age, he believed that drinking less would help reduce those frequent nighttime bathroom visits. But now he understood. Dehydration made urine more concentrated, irritating the bladder and, in turn, the prostate. That constant low-level stress on the body wasn't doing him any favors. Staying hydrated throughout the day, even in small sips, was a quiet act of kindness his body had long been denied. Later that morning, he noticed another old habit. After breakfast, he sat in his recliner with the newspaper, barely moving for over an hour. Then he moved to his desk, where he would sit again for hours working on his model airplanes. Richard realized how much time he spent seated every day. The pressure on his pelvic area, the sluggish blood flow. No wonder things weren't working smoothly down there. Determined to change, he set a timer on his phone. Every 30 minutes, it chimed softly, reminding him to get up and move. Sometimes, he'd walk around the house. Other times, he'd step outside, breathe in the air, and stretch his arms toward the sky. These short movements felt insignificant at first, but within a few days, his hips felt looser and the heaviness in his lower body lessened. But the most surprising discovery came from the coffee itself. Richard adored his morning brew, but he never considered how multiple cups a day could affect him. Caffeine was a diuretic, after all, and it stimulated his bladder unnecessarily. That extra urgency, the frequent need to urinate, it all connected. He didn't quit coffee entirely, but cut back to one mild cup and switched to herbal teas for the rest of the day. Small shifts, not dramatic overhauls, defined Richard's progress. He learned to listen, to adjust, and to give his body what it quietly asked for. Water, movement, and moderation became his new rhythm. As the days passed, he felt not just relief, but pride. Because healing, he realized, often starts with the smallest decisions made with care. It was during a quiet Sunday afternoon that Richard stood in front of his pantry, holding a jar of spicy pickles in one hand and a bag of salted chips in the other. He glanced toward the dining table where his lunch, processed ham sandwiches, and a can of soda waited. He sighed, not out of guilt, but realization. These had been staples of his routine for years, comfort foods from his younger days, but now, with his new awareness, they seemed more like threats than treats. Richard remembered reading how heavily processed foods, especially those high in sodium, additives, and unhealthy fats, contributed to inflammation throughout the body. That inflammation didn't just affect the heart or joints. It could quietly target the prostate, too. He had dismissed this idea at first, thinking his love for spicy snacks and salty meals was harmless indulgence. But his nightly discomfort, the pressure in his lower abdomen, and his frequent urination all told a different story. He thought of George again, who once said, "Your kitchen can be your medicine cabinet or your biggest enemy." That truth struck deeper now. Richard began to observe the labels on his food more carefully. He was shocked at the number of preservatives and artificial ingredients, even in simple items like canned soups and frozen meals. What he once thought was convenient turned out to be a slow, steady attack on his body's delicate balance. So he made a gentle shift. He didn't throw everything out. Instead, he began replacing one item at a time. Leafy greens replaced packaged sides. Fresh berries took the place of cookies. He tried grilled salmon instead of sausages, and olive oil instead of butter. He didn't go on a strict diet. He simply chose foods that felt alive, colorful, and nourishing. He discovered roasted sweet potatoes with rosemary, vibrant salads with walnuts, and even a creamy avocado spread that made him forget about mayonnaise altogether. Perhaps the biggest change was his relationship with spices. Richard loved bold flavors, and he feared he'd lose that joy. But he soon learned that not all spices were harmful. Turmeric, ginger, and basil added warmth without the harshness of chili or black pepper. He began to experiment, making simple meals more interesting without compromising his health. What surprised him most wasn't just how different his body felt, less bloated, calmer at night, but how empowered he became. Food was no longer just fuel or habit. It became an ally. In nourishing himself mindfully, Richard felt a growing sense of peace. His kitchen was no longer a source of quiet damage. It had become a space of quiet healing. One chilly morning, Richard sat at the edge of his bed, debating whether to get up and go to the bathroom or wait until he felt a stronger urge. It was early, still dark outside, and the bed was warm. He decided to wait. But as he lay back down, a nagging thought crept in. He had read that holding urine too long could strain the bladder and even harm the prostate. Was this small act of convenience causing more harm than he imagined? Over the next few days, Richard paid closer attention. To his bathroom habits, he noticed a pattern. Often, he'd delay going simply because he was too busy or didn't want to interrupt a task. Sometimes, he'd wait hours, even though he felt the need. But now, with greater awareness, he began responding to his body's signals sooner. No longer dismissing them as mere inconveniences. He also noticed that, despite going regularly, he sometimes didn't feel completely empty afterward. That unsettled him. In his readings, he had learned that incomplete emptying could lead to urine retention, encouraging bacteria growth and inflammation. Two things no man with an aging prostate wanted to invite. Taking this seriously, Richard adjusted his routine. He made sure to use the restroom as soon as the urge appeared. At night, if he felt the need, he no longer hesitated. That simple change, surprisingly, improved the quality of his sleep. He wasn't tossing and turning, waiting for a better time to get up. His bladder was calmer, and he felt more rested. But it wasn't just internal habits that he addressed. Richard had smoked for years, quitting only a decade ago. Still, he often found himself in social settings where others smoked. He had always waved it off, thinking, "I don't smoke anymore, so it's fine," but it wasn't. Secondhand smoke carried the same harmful chemicals, ones that reduced circulation and increased oxidative stress, both of which impacted prostate health. The next time his neighbor lit a cigarette beside him, Richard gently moved farther away and kindly asked if they could sit in a smoke-free space. It was a small moment, but a meaningful one. He had spent decades accommodating others at the cost of his health. Now, he was choosing differently. By simply honoring natural signals and protecting himself from toxic exposure, Richard was reclaiming something deeper than comfort. He was honoring his body's wisdom. The little choices, like when to pee or where to sit, began to feel like powerful declarations of self-respect. For most of his adult life, Richard had avoided doctors. It wasn't out of fear exactly, but more from a sense of pride. Like many men of his generation, he believed in enduring discomfort quietly, trusting his body to take care of itself. A visit to the doctor only happened when something was truly unbearable. Mild annoyances? Those were just part of getting older. Or so he thought. But after weeks of subtle but meaningful changes in his habits, Richard began to wonder what else he might be missing. He had started to feel better. Yes, more rested, less tense. But he wanted to understand what was happening beneath the surface. Still, the thought of a prostate exam made his stomach tighten. It wasn't the exam itself. It was the vulnerability, the awkwardness, and the fear of hearing something he didn't want to know. He brought it up with George during one of their afternoon walks. George listened, nodding thoughtfully. "I've been getting mine checked every year since I turned 60, he said gently. "It's not fun, but it gives me peace of mind. And if anything changes, I'll know early enough to do something about it." That night, Richard sat with the idea. He wasn't in crisis, and that was exactly the point. Prostate issues often grew silently. Waiting for real pain or dysfunction could mean waiting too long. So, he picked up the phone the next morning and made an appointment with Dr. Simmons, his primary care physician. The visit was surprisingly ordinary. The staff was kind, the office warm and quiet. Dr. Simmons explained everything clearly. A PSA blood test, a brief digital rectal exam, and a few questions about urinary habits. It was over in minutes. Richard felt a mix of relief and quiet embarrassment. Relief that it wasn't as bad as he feared, and embarrassment that he had waited so long. A week later, Dr. Simmons called. "Your numbers look good, Richard. No signs of trouble, but I'm glad you came in. Let's keep checking once a year." That call brought an unexpected wave of calm. He realized the visit hadn't just ruled out danger, it had given him confidence. Regular screenings, he now understood, weren't about reacting to illness. They were about staying ahead of it. They were about self-respect, not weakness. And, with each appointment moving forward, Richard was no longer waiting for disaster. He was choosing prevention. In a quiet, steady way, he was becoming his own best advocate. It was during a spring afternoon, as Richard bent to tie his shoes, that he felt it. A tightness around his midsection that hadn't been there years ago. The waistband of his trousers pressed against his belly, and for a moment, he stood in the front of the mirror, observing the soft, rounded shape that had crept in over time. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to make him pause. He thought back to something he had read. That abdominal fat wasn't just cosmetic. It actively contributed to inflammation and hormonal imbalances, especially affecting the prostate. That struck a chord. He'd always associated weight gain with heart health, never realizing how deeply it could influence his urinary tract and sexual function. Richard didn't panic or set off on a radical diet. Instead, he decided to make slow, reasonable changes. He started by trimming his portions, less bread with dinner, fewer sugary snacks in the evening. He didn't count calories, but he listened more closely to his hunger. He realized he was often eating out of habit, not need. He also replaced a few familiar staples. Where bacon and sausages once filled his breakfast plate, he now reached for scrambled eggs with sautéed spinach or a bowl of oatmeal with berries. He found satisfaction not in restriction, but in feeling lighter, more mobile. His digestion improved, his energy climbed, and his sleep became deeper. But perhaps the biggest shift came when he examined his meat consumption. Richard had always been a steak and potatoes man. Red meat was a comfort food, an anchor of his generation. Yet he couldn't ignore the research linking high red meat intake, especially processed forms like deli meats and hot dogs, to increased inflammation and prostate enlargement. So, he tried alternatives. Grilled salmon, lentil stews, and roasted. Vegetables began to take center stage. At first, he missed the familiar richness of beef, but he soon discovered a new appreciation for flavors he'd ignored for years. Food became not just fuel, but something that respected his changing body. And then there were the walks. Every afternoon, after lunch, he strolled through the neighborhood. Not a power walk, not exercise in the traditional sense, but steady, intentional movement. It helped melt away the extra weight. But more than that, it gave him rhythm. Time to breathe. Time to notice. Richard's belly didn't disappear overnight, but the slow reduction was real. He felt it in his clothes, in his joints, in the way he stood. Most of all, he felt it in the quiet calm of his body. A body finally heard, finally supported, and no longer burdened by the weight of years ignored. One rainy evening, Richard sat by the window, watching droplets slide slowly down the glass. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that used to soothe him. But lately, silence had become something else, an echo chamber for thoughts he didn't always know how to silence. His mind wandered often now, to his wife's health, to rising bills, to questions about the future. It wasn't panic, just a steady hum of tension that rarely left him. He had never thought of stress as a health issue. Stress was just life. But through everything he'd read and learned these past weeks, Richard began to understand how deeply it affected his body. Cortisol, the stress hormone, didn't just make him feel anxious. It increased inflammation, disrupted hormones, tightened the very muscles around his pelvis. It was, in many ways, a silent contributor to the discomfort. He'd spent months trying to ease. Determined not to let it control him, Richard decided to try something different. Not grand gestures or drastic changes, but quiet rituals. Each morning, before checking his phone or the news, he sat with a cup of tea in silence for 10 minutes. No agenda, just breathing. It felt strange at first, almost pointless. But slowly, something shifted. The racing thoughts didn't disappear, but they softened. His breath deepened. The tightness in his chest loosened just a bit. He also rediscovered music. Old jazz records from his youth became a balm in the evenings, filling the space that silence had made heavy. He called his daughter more often, not to talk about anything urgent, but just to hear her voice. He began journaling, not long entries, just a few lines each day about what made him feel grateful, what made him smile. Then there was laughter. He had forgotten how good it felt to laugh, truly laugh. One night, watching an old comedy with George, they both chuckled until their eyes watered. Richard realized in that moment that healing didn't always look like pills or procedures. Sometimes it looked like joy. Stress hadn't vanished. Life, with all its unpredictability, continued. But now, Richard had tools, not to fight stress, but to meet it with steadiness and care. His body responded in kind, less urgency, fewer restless nights, and a sense of ease he hadn't felt in years. In tending to his emotional world, Richard found not just peace, but power. His journey wasn't about perfection, it was about presence. And with each day, he felt more at home in his body, more alive in his life, and more deeply connected to the calm he had created within.